Okay, so welcome to our first webinar on equine pasture management. Now, this whole series was meant to be timed so whenever we kind of go over each topic, that you'd have enough time to then make some decisions before you rolled into that season. So the first one's a little rushed, and it's actually based more on some of the impacts that we had from our fall drought on some decision-making times that we need to make sure they happen right away. There's things that we would typically do in the fall that we still maybe have a little window that we can try to do this spring. But pasture management is always extremely difficult, and when you add horses into it, it becomes a real challenge. And a lot of times I like to go out to different people's farms, and we do farm consults, and one of the first things I talk about is goals or expectations for what you're wanting to get from your pasture. And over our next few webinars, we'll start to get into some of those goals. But a lot of times our expectations and our goals don't necessarily come with reality as far as what our pastures are capable of doing in at least the southern region. So from there, it's just kind of finding a middle ground on some realistic goals and expectations for the size of our pastures, the quality of our ground, the number of horses, and our stocking rate on those pastures. But we're going to start talking a little bit about this past fall's drought and kind of some impacts it may have and some decisions that we can do. Now, one thing I would ask is that if everybody can please help by filling out that survey, that's really going to help us create programming that fits your needs and kind of identifies the problems that you guys have, and so how we can best fit and actually identify some webinars that fit that. So we're working with the pasture one right now, but if there's others from equine liability, nutrition, things like that, we can bring in some specialists across the state to do this. So as we begin, we talk about springtime thoughts and just pasture management. And one of them is we're kind of looking at late fall. Now, this picture is not an exact example of what happened this past fall, but if you look real clear, I mean, the green grass is probably not the ideal thing, but if you look at this thing right here, that's what we call our sage grass. And sage grass is a piece of grass that is really, it's not edible for the most part. Horses and cattle really are not going to eat it. So what out there is just taking nutrients from your other grasses. When you start to see sage grass, that typically means that you have two issues. One is that your pH is probably a little bit lower than what it needs to be, and it grows at a lower pH than grass. And we're really going to get into the details about our cool season forages next week, but we wanted to just get in some thoughts about what we could do for the drought possibilities. So sage grows really well when the pH is too low. And the second one, it grows really well when there's no competition. So if we had a great and really cool wet fall, this fescue would be really taking off and it would outcompete this sage. Well, with the drought that we had, that the sage really had an opportunity to grow. Then if you have any type of overgrazing on your fescue just gets absolutely wiped out, and then sage can just go uncontrolled. And that's the situation that we found ourselves in this year. It was everywhere you looked, and all winter long you could see it. So, and this is our typical kind of stepping stone as we go through the winter for a lot of our equine pastures. We go from the sage pasture to this is what a lot of our pastures look like during the winter. You don't have all those weeds growing in there. So what looked like a big green pasture now just has what little fescues left growing. And so you have all that dirt that was once covered by weeds is now left exposed. So you start to get a lot of soil erosion. Your fescue, number 2, is not growing at all. And so it's not really trying to take up any of this water because it's not getting enough sunlight to really grow. And so temperature-wise, so all our pastures really are going to do, so anytime we're on our pastures in the winter, damage is about the only thing that we can actually see with that. So the next stage then becomes, let's see here. That's what early spring is starting to look like. This is probably a lot of our grasses. This is what we're starting to see. You can see that as we look on here, we have a little bit of fescue grass growing right here. Some fescue grass growing right in here. These little spots right here are fescue grass. But everywhere we don't see fescue, we start to see weeds filling in. I mean, there's a weed right there. So that open space, just like in that previous picture, that open space where the grass wasn't growing and there was just mud, our annual weeds and our perennial weeds are starting to fill in. So when you look across your pasture, it can look pretty green during the spring, but as you can see from this picture, there's lots of weeds that are filling in that green space. And so this is what our typical pasture would look like during the spring for a lot of these pastures that have a lot of horses on them. And then this is what mid to late spring starts to look like. We have these beautiful Tennessee flowers out there, and I bet a lot of people can probably identify with this situation. Is now our fescue is being outpaced by buttercup, the state flower. And so you can see you have all these beautiful pastures full of bright yellow flowers, and they grow extremely fast, and they are inedible for cattle, horses. It doesn't matter what it is, they're inedible. So what we try to look at is how can we prevent this cyclical cycle that we have of going from the fall sage grass to getting to the winter, to the soil erosion, the muddy fields, to the early spring where we're starting to see the grass start to go, but all the weeds are starting to fill in those bare spots, and then to this one. So what it gets us to is this fall exacerbated everything that we typically see on a typical spring. So let's see. There we go. So when we've got to this fall, we had an extreme conditions. We had all those things. And so now we're looking at this, for this upcoming spring, we're looking at where we would normally have a pretty high weed pressure, but fescue really in the spring really starts to take off, especially if you add some type of fertilizer to it. Your tall fescue will really start to go. And it will actually outcompete some of these weeds. Well, with the scenario that we have now, with our fescue getting really worn down, especially in those overstocking rates, we got into situations now where we have even more bare spots where we're going to start to see even more weeds. And that can lead to a couple of different things. But one of the main ones is now we have increased pressure on our actual tall grass, because now we have all these weeds. And now we have a higher seeding rate. So if we don't control these weed seeds, we're going to have an abundance of weeds producing seed. And so for the following spring, these weeds are still going to be there and still increasing their weed pressure, even if we start to put in our tall fescue at some point during this year. So one of our big goals as we come up through this period is to actually try to control these weeds right away. And we'll talk, like I said, in this next webinar, we'll get into actually understanding your grass, which I think is probably the most important webinar that we can have the entire time. Is if you can understand your grass, then you can know how it grows and how it, when the stress points are, and when it can really take off and be a real benefit. But when we start talking about weeds, one of the biggest negatives to the weeds that you can have is if you can add all kinds of pressure on the weeds by out competing them with fescue, that can be a extreme weed control. I mean, pasture spraying and chemicals are a must for some things, but the number one thing that you can do is actually provide competition for your weeds. So we'll try to look into a few of those things that we can do. So, but as we look at the spring impact, we have decrease in our cool season forages. And when we talk about cool season forages, we talk about tall fescue. And then we could get into warm season, which we'll talk a little bit later, and that would be like Bermuda. So we saw a tremendous decrease from the drought in our cool season forages, and thus, in all those bare spots, we're going to have a tremendous increase in weed pressure. And what does all that lead to? Well, part of it is it can lead to possible soil erosion areas. And if you look at this picture right here of this slanted hill, of course, this is obviously not from this year, but if you have horses overgrazing a lot of this area, you're going to have a lot of fescue that is now gone, that you're going to start to see some soil erosion. So if you come in here and spray and knock out a bunch of weeds, you could have some possible soil erosion. So in certain situations like this, we have a couple of different scenarios that we're going to talk about that you can help use to control. But that is one of the possible effects from the drought, is we got some highly erodible areas for the soil. So what are my options? What can we do this spring immediately to help offset or to prep us for the upcoming late spring, summer, and fall? And so we look at it, there's about 3 different options that you can really start to do. And one of the most immediate things that you can do is soil test. That is the cheapest tool that we have available to us, no matter where you're in the country. A soil test can give you lots of different information that can make a lot of the other inputs that you put into your grass even feasible. You could put thousands and thousands of dollars worth of inputs like nitrogen or fertilizer and other different things that go along with that. You can put those on your ground, and if you don't have the right pH for your grass, they'll all go to waste. So soil test is the number one thing. It can be done any time of year, and you can start actually moving on the soil test results right away, depending on what the actual inputs are. But that's the number one thing I can talk about, and we'll talk about that probably in every one of our little webinars. That's what we need to do. So then now it comes down to, we've got kind of 3 different options for immediate control. So we can do the method of, let's plan for fall. So let's go ahead and control the weeds that we see right now. We're not going to do any reseeding. We're just going to prep for this fall when we're actually going to come in here and reseed. So what are some of those steps that we need to do? The second one would be, okay, the fall drought completely wiped out all of my pasture. I literally have nothing left other than dirt. I need something for my horses because I don't want to feed hay all year round. What can I do? Or I have some really big bare spots where there's some soil erosion on a hillside, and I don't want it to wash into my creek. So what can I do to put out there right now that will grow, that I can still plan on prepping for this fall? And we'll get into that. And then we'll look at the final option, which would be kind of reseeding some of our cool season perennial grasses, or for most of you, it will be tall fescue. So we'll kind of go through each one of these real quick. Like I said, if you guys have a question, just unmute and start talking, and it will let you take over. So we look at first weed control and prep for this fall. Our number one goal for this aspect of it is, if we can get the environment, so it is, you can't control Mother Nature, but if we can do all that we can from our point of view as far as prepping the environment for ultimate and prime seeding this fall, because in Tennessee, the best time, and it's proven time and time again, the best time to reseed is the fall. And, typically we would say September to October, mid-September to mid-October. But with the past 3 or 4 years, September tends to be pretty hot and pretty dry. So we've kind of actually pushed that timeline back a little bit, but it really is kind of weather dependent on that fall seeding. But our first goal of this number one is, what can we do in the meantime between now and fall to get us ready to go so that our pasture is in ultimate shape? And a lot of that is controlling our weeds, because if we control our weeds at a correct time right now, then we won't necessarily have that same weed pressure coming back next spring. And if you get a couple of years of good control, you can wipe out a lot of your weeds, and you won't necessarily have to do as much weed control spraying as others would. So what are the steps? Soil health. So that's number one, and that comes right back to where we're at with our soil test. And like I said, we'll get into understanding grass a little bit later, but a lot of it is grass has to have a certain pH to grow, and if you don't get it to that pH, it's just never going to grow as well as it is. Now, fescue does struggle here in Tennessee, but it's the best grass that we have as far as managing the heat. But getting your soil health correct is number one. So you got to have the right nutrients in the ground, and that all starts with the soil test, and then you can put those nutrients in the ground right away outside of nitrogen. Timely spraying, and so that involves getting out there and getting the weeds at the correct time. And a lot of times we talk about the correct time being when it starts to get, you start to get 3 or 4 days above 60, and maybe 2 days after you spray above 60. For the most part, we've got a couple of different spraying things that we can talk about as far as different chemicals that have different temperatures. But we like to say that, kind of that late February to mid-March. Now this year, the timeline's being ramped up. A lot of times I mention to people spraying, especially on the lawns, spraying for, when you talk about crabgrass prevention, by spraying by the forsythia bush. When the forsythia bush is blooming, you're right at that timeline where you need to have it out, because once it's in full bloom, you're too late and you've kind of missed the window. Crabgrass is starting to go. And just driving into work this morning, I happened to notice the forsythia bush is starting to bloom, which is about 20 to 30 days ahead of schedule. So these weeds are out there. If we continue to see this warm temperatures, they're going to be starting to go to seed a little bit earlier. So timely spraying is very important. If you see weeds that are 3, 4, 5, 6 feet tall and they're starting to show seed, they have a flower and they're blooming, we've missed our time cycle. So we can still spray those weeds. We can, and to some degree, we can kill them, but they've already gone to seed. So for the next spring, we have that same amount of weeds is going to be right back in our pasture once again. So getting out there and getting them sprayed when they're 3, 4 inches tall, most of our chemicals can be really active and really knock down a lot of these chemicals or these weeds. As they get bigger, the effectiveness of these chemicals becomes much more difficult to take care of. It's just like, any one of us can chop down a tree the size of your pinky, but when you start trying to chop down a redwood, it becomes much more difficult. So, getting out there and getting them really early would be the key to that. So timely spraying, so you don't have to deal with the weeds next year. And the same thing will go with the summer, and we'll talk about the summer a little bit later. But then clipping. Clipping is if I can't get out there in time, or spraying is not going to be in your regimen. Your alternative is to clip them, is to keep those weeds from going to ever seed. So if they start to get to 8, 10, 12 inches tall, and you can get out there and clip them before they go to seed or before they bloom, and you keep them clipped, that's going to reduce the amount of seed out there. Now, like I said, buttercup is a much shorter weed, so you're going to have to get out there. But if it starts to show yellow flower, you're too late. So you need to get out there and clip them before they show their yellow flowers. One of the things you can also do is if you missed your timely spraying, and this would be a good example, would be in a hay field, but you could also do it in your pasture. If you've missed your spray period, let's say something happens, you just can't get out there till April, you can actually go back through there, clip those weeds, even though they've already gone to seed. You can clip them, restart that growth, and then come back and spray them, 3 or 4 days after that. If they've had some time to really start growing, 3 or 4 days after that, you can come in there and that chemical will do a really good job of knocking them out. But weeds, we have all kinds of different weeds in Tennessee, and they're all not susceptible to the same chemicals. So we have some that do better than others, and they all come at different costs. And we'll talk about that as we move on to the next one. The The second one we have is planting an annual grass and then also controlling our weeds. So annual ryegrass is typically, we will plant that in early winter, and then it will really start to come on and grow during the springtime. So the reason why I wanted to get out there and talk about this webinar right away is that we're at the very end of this window where we can plant this annual ryegrass and get it to come up, and it will provide a really good forage. Like I said, it only grows one time, so you have to replant it each time that you want to. But what will happen is if you put it out right now, you would have a good stand of forage from now until about mid-May. And so what this is a good place to do it is if you're wanting to still plan on reseeding during this fall, is if you have some areas that are really, really worn out, or you've got hillsides that are really worn out and you're starting to see some erosion, you can plant this annual ryegrass, and it will provide you almost 2 tons of forage. So if you've got a couple horses, it can provide a lot of forage. You just have to really restrict on how much they can get in there because it's a pretty rich forage. But the key is you want to plant it in areas that you plan on reseeding in the fall. You just don't have anything there during the summer, and you'd really like to get off of feeding hay. This stuff is really aggressive, so if you have any type of small fescue in there, it's going to outgrow that fescue and probably shade it out and even kill it. So you don't want to plant this stuff where you've got a really good establishment of fescue, because it will outcompete it. And that's one of the key terms we talk about in a lot of things is outcompeting. So annual ryegrass, it's got a lot of good uses, but we're kind of at that window where this has to be done immediately, and identifying the planting areas. So if this is something you think you're considering, absolutely give me a call, shoot me an email. We can talk about the logistics of doing it. But you got to seed immediately. You have to drill it into the ground. You can't just broadcast it like a lot of things that we do when we talk about fescue. Then we'll add a little bit of fertilizer on top of that to really get it a good push. The key is you got to keep your horses off of it until it's up and growing. And until you have 8, 10, 12 inches of this stuff, you really need to keep your horses off of it. And the longer you keep them off of it, the better. But if you put them out there 2 days after, or even 2 weeks after, they'll just destroy the crop. So that's always a challenge for a lot of us, is having the space to be able to keep them off. But that's the key to getting this grass to grow, is you got to keep them off. And then we can come through here and clip it, depending on the number of horses we have and the space. If it starts to get too big on us, we may need to come back through here and clip the grass to let it restart growth so it stays nice and fresh. And then we'll just continue to follow. If we do this, we'll continue to follow our weed control and prep for the fall. Like I said, this grass is only going to grow during this spring. So this is an annual forage, which means it just grows once from seed. Like tall fescue is what we call perennial, and it will continue to grow year after year. It will start to play itself out over a few years, but annual, we have to replant it every year. But this is a good temporary forage. If we just don't have any pasture and we're desperate to get some pasture, this is a really good temporary forage. Then we get into the last one, and this is an option, but there's a reason why I put it last, is we can look into reseeding our cool season perennial grass, which for most of us, reseeding tall fescue. You have to really warn you when you start talking about doing this, and we've talked about it from the beginning here, is that this fall is the ideal time. And the reason why we don't like it during the spring, I just put up there a long list of the issues that we see is when it comes to actually competition, there's so many other weeds and other things that are out competing it, that are growing faster than it will when you first seed this. If you've ever done seeding in the fall, you kind of see how slow it starts to get going. And if you got weeds that are going at 4 or 5 times that rate, they're going to take all the nutrients, they're going to shade it out, and you're just going to get a terrible stand. The past 3 or 4 years, we've had a pretty dry spring, actually. It seems we have a dry spring, a wet summer, and then a dry fall. But getting into spring drought, you're going to have issues there with this seed getting going. I see a message here. We'll try to wrap it up. And then you just talk about summer, drought, horses, everything. It's just a very difficult thing to try to do. So it's a very low success rate. You're better off to save your money now and invest later. It's just I just have very rarely have seen any opportunities where fescue planted in the spring survives. You really need 2 rainy seasons. You need the fall rainy season and the spring rainy season to go. Now, if you are determined to make this happen, I'm gonna plant fescue one way or the other. The keys to that, you're gonna need to get that out right away, immediately. Get it drilled into the ground, and then you're gonna need to put 2 steps of fertilizer. You probably put a fertilizer on. You might put 30 to 45 pounds of fertilizer on immediately at planting, and then another 30 to 45 at probably mid-April. And then your horses can't touch it until that grass is 8 inches tall at least. You're talking midsummer or probably into spring, summer. So that's really challenging itself. So in the end, the take back from that is, unless you're just determined you want to plant grass, save your money, kind of do these steps in between, and that will get you set up for a high quality fall. So just a few things here as we wrap it up. The first step that anybody can do before there's so many things that there are options out there, but the first one that should be for everybody should be get a soil test done. That can tell you lots of information and keep you from wasting a lot of money on it. The second would be, this is an option that you can give me a call or email me. We could do a site consult on your pastures, be able to walk through there, discuss what you've got going on, and a few different options. Are there any questions at this point? If you have a question, just unmute. If not, right now, the next one is understanding your grass, and I think this is the most important webinar that we'll have for the rest of the time, and that once we have an understanding of what our grass is capable of and what it can do and where are the stress points at it, then I think we can really understand and be able to combat our pasture. So from here on out, we'll try to get into different aspects of your pasture, and I'll go through the surveys that you guys send me and try to see what other issues that you guys are having, and try to key these presentations to some of those issues you guys are having. But this is one of the most important ones coming up on the 8th. I'll once again send the link out probably on that Tuesday before. But do you guys have any questions beforehand? And the only other thing I would say is, if you could please just try to get that survey in, that will really give me an idea where to proceed from here.
Matt?
Yes.
If we would like you to do a site visit, do we just email you and then set that up? Yes, the email would be best, and then or give me a call, and then we'll try to work out a time. I know it's difficult with everybody's schedule, but we'll try to work out a time we can go out there and look at it. Thank you. Once again, I will post this. I'm one of those guys, when he presents, I don't like to put a lot of words on my screen, so you just feel like I'm just reading the screen. So I will post this and send a link where the recording is at, so you guys can go back through. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to give me a call. And in the meantime, we'll take any questions. If not, we'll move on with our next webinar here in a couple of weeks, trying to understand our grass. Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat screen. Any other questions live? Okay, I hope everybody has a good day, and we will try to keep these roughly to 30 minutes. Some will be a little bit longer than others. So thank you. Have a good day.